Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for our campaign webinar, Face the Music, We Need a New Deal for Musicians. For those who don't know me, I'm Michael Anderson from the European Movement staff team, and I have the pleasure of being your chair this evening. Our latest campaign, Face the Music, is calling on the UK government to work with the EU and negotiate a solution in the form of a new bilateral agreement to the post-Brexit barriers facing musicians. This includes musicians, but also crew, dancers, and everyone who makes a living off of live music. Everyone who needs and wants to work and tour in the EU, as well as our European counterparts who need and want to perform in the UK. We're here tonight to look in detail at the post-Brexit issues facing the live music sector, at how we can put this campaign on the top of the political agenda, and how you joining us tonight can make this happen. As a musician myself, this is an issue which is very close to my heart. So I, for one, am thrilled that as an organisation, the European movement is tackling this head on and is working to raise awareness of just how bad things have become for so many musicians, both in the UK and in the EU. Regarding our speakers, we will hear first from Matt Cargill, a touring musician, promoter and technical manager, about how Brexit has changed his life working in music. We will then hear from John Collins, Chief Executive of Live, about the big picture, the lay of the land, and about what can be done to improve the situation for musicians. We will then pass over to Maura McKeown, our local campaigns manager, and Yvonne, who is the chair of our branches forum. They will take us through the details of the Face the Music Action Weekend and walk us through how each of you can get involved with it next weekend. And then our last speaker before the Q&A session will be Mike Edwards. Mike is an EM member and an activist at European Movement Sussex, who will discuss how their group ran their own music last year. Once we've heard from each of our speakers, we will then move into the Q&A session. This is when we will discuss any questions you have about the Face the Music campaign itself or about the upcoming Action Weekend. You can ask your questions in the chat anytime from now, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can in the Q&A session. When typing your question, please say which speaker the question is for. My colleague Scott Daniels will be watching the questions and will bring them up onto the screen during the session, which will begin at around 7:15 p.m, and we will wrap up the webinar at 7:30. If you can't put your question into the chat for accessibility reasons, then you can email your question to events@europeanmovement.co.uk and Scott will add them into the system. Please know that this webinar is also being recorded and we are streaming live right now on YouTube. So as always, keep the language clean. Now let's get into it and bring our first speaker on screen, and that is Matt Cargill. Now, Matt has been in a touring band for over 10 years. His first EU tour was back in 2015. He works as a touring musician with Sly and the Family Drone and is the tech manager of the King Alfred Phoenix Theatre in Golders Green, North London. Matt, thank you for joining us. So I want to start off by asking, first of all, Matt, what was touring in the EU like before Brexit?
Was a dream come true. It was absolutely the most fun you could have. You know, our first ever tour, going to Europe, got invited to go and play a festival, which was as simple as getting an email from somebody, getting confirmed, going and having the best fun and playing some other dates around it. And we'd basically done that since, you know, in the following years, festivals and tours, getting to travel to places you've never been to before, see amazing bands, share that incredible experience. It was the best, all pretty seamless, just your passport and your gear, and that was it.
I mean, that sounds a dream. And when we spoke to you at the King Alfred Phoenix Theatre, you told us now that the situation is quite different. You told us that the post-Brexit carnet was over £1,000. And I'd like to maybe ask you a bit more about what a carnet is for those who don't know. You told us how each piece of equipment had to be itemised and you had to wait for up to 8 hours at Dover, and it cost around £1,000 for the pleasure. So can you just explain a little what a carnet is for those who don't know?
Yeah, so it's basically a sort of a voucher or a passport for all your specific equipment. So for your backlines, for anything that so you've got your instruments, but all your amplifiers, any mixers, any gear that you need to make your show happen, basically would need to be itemized on a import and export list, and it would need to be all stamped as you leave England or leave the UK, as you get into France, and then the same coming back. And obviously, it's a document essentially to prove that you're basically for tax purposes that you're not importing equipment or selling goods across borders. Whilst that document itself, I think it's based on total value of equipment. So for some people, it can vary depending what you have, but essentially there's still a minimum cost, and that's hundreds and hundreds of pounds that people didn't necessarily have to pay for before the Brexit implications sort of happened.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for explaining that, Matt. And I get for those joining us tonight. So I guess beyond the money, can you sort of try and explain for us how else Brexit has impacted you and your ability to perform and work in the EU?
Well, just before we, sort of even having to navigate that stuff was a massive barrier. So before the sort of in 2022, I think that was our first experience of trying to do it again, and just to sort of test the waters and see what's possible in a post-Brexit landscape. And the sheer amount of red tape and stuff to wade through that hadn't even been a consideration before. It was such a simple, seamless process as you'd go and play in another town. But now the sheer amount of documentation and stuff you have to figure out because the guidance isn't actually clear. Those is kind of a minefield for people who either aren't used to it or just aren't that. You may have some crews might have a tour manager or other people to do that for them, but for bands who just go and play, or individuals who don't have that support, it's an absolute sort of logistical nightmare. And the wait times and the sort of bureaucracy just actually do it is one, but then there's sort of tangible effects of your actual bands aren't getting the booking opportunity, so that's actually dropped off, whereby people aren't getting invited to play as many European festivals, one because of there are visa implications, but also the costs involved and the crew. Why would you have to sort of navigate all that stuff when you could easily just recruit European crew or artists, and that isn't an implication that you have to deal with. So those opportunities are happening, but also with our merchandise orders, records and stuff that we basically rely on, pretty much dropped off overnight. And I'd sort of asked other, bands and record shops and people who are still dealing with it. Essentially, that aspect of their business has disappeared. So you're losing half of your business, whereby records now, because there's either extra tax added for importing records from the UK, or that the shipping costs themselves have just gone up astronomically. So people just don't want to source that, and that's for individuals. On a small level, might just post one record to one individual, but also for people who are shipping stuff wholesale. So that's large record labels who are getting stuff pressed in the EU, or distros that are shipping stuff out as well. And that aspect of their business has just totally disappeared.
Okay, I mean, this is really obviously tricky and hard to hear. So I guess, in the interest of balance, though, have you heard of any acts have they benefited from it? Who's benefited from these rules, and how are people working around it? Like, what have you heard?
I mean, the only people I can see have actually benefited from it is the Chamber of Commerce. I don't think there's actually, I don't know anecdotally or any actual evidence of any bands that have any of this process has made it easier for any performers or crew. As far as I'm concerned, and evidence dictates that we don't are yet to receive any benefits of this. We're losing out money, we're losing out opportunities. and that sort of cultural exchange has just totally disappeared from our aspect of being in a band at the moment.
Yeah, and so lastly, given all this, what do you think a solution to this looks like? What do you think would make things better for musicians?
I think it may seem that there is currently the portable musical equipment exemption, which allows you to take a sort of single, you can jump on a plane or accompany your gear. So that may be a easing of some of it, but none of it is absolutely clear. It's all sort of guidance, and it still feels overwhelming to navigate that. There's no hard and fast rules to say you must do this. It's fine. You don't have to do this. It's still quite vague. There isn't any actual guidance. So actually going forward to figure that out, to have a set out, agreement and say, yes, you do have to do this. No, you don't have to do this. You can go and play freely. There is a freedom of movement, and that there's the visa waiver that was in the sort of reports that came out last year, and the government are sort of wanting to, or governments hopefully will agree to a bilateral visa waiver, easing of carnets, easing of freedom of movement, so that the bands are able to go and tour and to have that opportunity again, and it's not a barrier to people.
Matt, thank you. That's all the time we have for Matt Cargill this evening. Thank you for joining us, Matt. If any of you want to hear more on Matt's story, you can head to our Face the Music page on the European Movement website, and Scott will be running the link across the screen for that shortly and throughout the webinar. Matt, thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Now it's time to welcome on screen John Collins. John is Chief Executive of Live, the voice of the UK's contemporary live music sector. Live members are a federation of 16 live music industry associations representing over 3,000 businesses, 34,000 artists and 2,000 backstage workers. Live is a relatively young organisation formed in response to the unprecedented pressure and devastation faced by the music industry due to COVID-19. Today, Live's work is to ensure that the interests of live music in the UK are understood and communicated to government, policymakers, regulators, the public and the wider music and entertainment industries. Now, John is actually dialing in from an event with a US congressional delegation where he is dealing with the fact that the US Department of Homeland Security have hiked up visa fees for musicians by around 240%. So we won't take up too much of John's time. John, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. Right, we'll get right into it. John, Matt spoke about the new costs, the delays and the red tape. Exactly how common are the problems that Matt has just described, and how are these affecting especially younger and up and coming artists?
Yeah, no, I mean, they are unfortunately all too common. We on a very regular basis, we are hearing about the musicians who should be able, through the exemption that Matt talked about for portable musical instruments, be able to take their guitar into Europe or take their saxophone. But there was a case in Bremen just last week where a saxophonist was fined €450. We had the musicians stopped in Lille with their guitar and fined, I think, a couple of €100. So there's a lack of understanding at the border as to what you can and cannot do. Matt said it's confusing enough for us as creatives, but actually the officials themselves still haven't got their head around what is and isn't permissible. You've then got bands who are missing gigs because they can't get their van onto the shuttle or on the ferry because there's a backlog of spaces, or there's a backlog of a queue to get the carnet stamped as they leave. All that paperwork and red tape causing delay. So they're missing shows, or they're having to choose to go a day earlier, and then they've got the cost of another hotel room, another day on the road, etc. You got the bands who are missing out because their merch isn't arriving. Like Matt said, being able to sell T-shirts and vinyl and CDs and other bits of merch at gigs is often the difference between a show being profitable and not profitable. And if that turns up a day late because it got held up due to some red tape, it's useless. It's no use that being there at the venue a day after you were. and then you're sort of trying to follow you around Europe, trying to find the thing and get it back, which is more cost and complexity. It's also hitting the classical sector. So orchestras can't use their own buses because they've got restrictions on cabotage, which is around where you can take your lorry from the UK into Europe, how many stops it can make, how many countries it can stop in before it has to come back. And it's 3 stops in 2 countries, which is useless if you're touring. So orchestras are having to hire abroad, increased cost. And we had an example just about 2 weeks ago where the hire coach, the air conditioning system went. So all that those precious instruments started to warp and flex. And, that's a horrendous story for an orchestra. So unfortunately, Matt's story is all too familiar.
So I want to pick up on that point, John, of the post-Brexit cabotage, because on Live's website, it says that you feel that this risks the collapse of the UK-based concert touring sector, which would lead to widespread company closures and job losses. And this is a vital point because I guess the reality is that when we're talking about the live music sector, many think that we're talking pretty much about musicians, about the faces that we all know and love. But can you speak a little bit more about how wide-ranging the impact of Brexit on the live music sector has been up to this point?
Absolutely. The general rule of thumb in the industry is 1 person on stage is 7 people off it. So, the crew are a huge part of this process. And we've had world-class talent in this country for decades. And around that has grown up world-class haulage companies, world-class tour management companies, world-class caterers, bus hire, makeup artists, security, all of the bits and pieces that you need to make those tours happen. We have led the world. That is now all in the process of being offshored to Europe, because either you, as an individual, you're being replaced by a European qualified individual, or as an individual, you're finding a route to an EU passport to be able to continue to trade. As a company, particularly on the haulage side, to overcome the cabotage issue, the biggest specialist hauliers have been able to set themselves up with a second head office inside the EU, but that isn't a route available to mid-sized and smaller hauliers who are just seeing that business dry up, unfortunately. And the combination of the 91 80-day Schengen restrictions, which we all live under now, means that anyone working in the live music sector, and it isn't really about the headline artist who's on stage, because they've got the ability to come in and out. It is all those people that support, including supporting musicians and artists who jump from tour to tour, who make their living from going around Europe in successive tours. They're now hitting that 90-day limit and seeing their jobs go to the Belgian bass player and the French drummer.
Yeah, now that we've spoken about just some of the problems post-Brexit, I want to look a little bit at the solution. On Live's website, it states that live music needs a transitional support package. I'm keen to know what this would entail. It says that a package like this would offer a quick solution to the government. Are you able to speak just a little bit about what a package like this would look like, and if possible, how the UK government has responded to this type of demand in the past?
It builds on what Matt said. What are the 2 biggest challenges to people trying to get into Europe to tour and gig at the moment? It's complexity and cost. So, yes, our overarching aim is to have touring reform reincorporated into the trade and cooperation agreement, or maybe something sat alongside. But as an immediate step, the government has the ability to provide clearer data, better data in a language that doesn't require musicians to be haulage specialists. And they've got the ability to throw some funding at the problem. And we're not talking huge amounts, we're talking billions, not millions, not billions, but and there has been progress by government. So there's, within the Department of Business and Trade, there is an export support service, the ESS team. Now, when that was established just a couple of years ago, it was very dry indeed. And we were just hearing people say, I tried and I gave up after 15 minutes because I just got lost in the tech, the blur, the legalese. That is getting better, and we are working with DBT, Department of Business and Trade, to try and get more practical case studies, to try and get more fragmented and tailored advice. So there is some optimism there that things are improving. And then the government has put an extra 1.6 million, taking it from 1.6 to 3.2, into the Music Export Growth Scheme, which is co-funded by DBT, DCMS, and industry, and is there for younger, smaller bands to be able to apply to say, I need 25,000, 15,000, wherever it may be, to make this tour viable. So that's a better pot, but it should be a lot bigger, given we are one of the only 2 music exporting countries on the planet. We are world leading. Government should be championing and enabling us, not putting barriers in our way.
Joe, that's really good to hear. That was actually my last question. I wanted to hear where we think progress is being made. So it's really good to hear that there are at least some areas where we're making progress. And with this campaign, we want to be really raising these issues and keeping it at the top of the political agenda. So, John, thank you for your time. We'll let you get on with the rest of your event. Really, really thank you for joining us. Thank you, John.
Pleasure. Thanks. Good luck with it all.
Thank you, John. Now we're going to bring on stage together Maura McKeon, our local campaigns manager, and Yvonne, chair of our branches forum, who are going to walk through what our Face the Music Action Weekend will involve and explain exactly how you can get involved with our Action Weekend, which is next Friday to Sunday. Maura and Yvonne, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're really excited about the campaign that Michael and the team have put together. As we've heard today, it's really timely, and that's why we've all clubbed together to organise an action weekend for activists, members and supporters that will run from the 1st of March to the 3rd. And we've got some really interesting campaign asks for you all. So you'll have seen from many of the emails, particularly if you're involved in our local groups, that we've got this action weekend coming up, and we've given you some opportunities to get some resources, including some money towards events in your area, and also some campaign resources, some print and literature and posters. And I'm just going to run through very quickly how you can use those, get involved with the campaign as a local group. And then Yvonne, who is representative here of all of our activists and chairs our branches forum, will tell you a little bit about how you can get involved in your local group if you're not already involved, because it's a really worthwhile thing to do as part of the movement. So what can our local groups and our activists do to get involved in this campaign? The first thing is we've got the action weekend coming up, and we're asking people to do something a bit different. Usually people do street stalls, sometimes do leafleting on their local area, their streets. But this time we're asking you to help us really target this campaign at the people who are going to really be the most receptive, and that's the gig-going, music-loving British public. So we're asking you to leaflet queues of people outside of local venues. We're offering you all free leaflets about the campaign that you can distribute in your local area. So we want you to find your local music venue, figure out if there's a gig on or if there's some kind of show, and go outside and leaflet the queues. I'm a classical music fan myself, but my friends and colleagues who enjoy more contemporary and modern music assure me that lots of people get leafleted outside of venues, and this is quite a common thing. And it would be great if the people who were going to the gigs could understand just how much those same musicians are being impacted by the problems that we've heard today. So if you want to, you can order your leaflets via the Grassroots Hub. If you order tomorrow, pretty much, you can be guaranteed that the leaflets will come. We've already sent the link out. We've already sent the date out as well. And they will be here in time for the action weekend. But even if you have something else on that weekend and you've not been able to organise anything, you can still organise on a different date and a different time. The campaign will be going in some form for quite a few months. So make sure that you get involved and you make sure you get those leaflets. The second thing we're asking groups to do is talk to local venues and build up a rapport, and then ask them to put a poster up for the campaign. We're offering free posters, so you can order those on the same form that you order the leaflets from on the Grassroots Hub. And it's a great way to introduce yourself to important local stakeholders and build those community relationships, which are really vital for the movement. The third thing we're asking you to do, which is important but might be a bit of work, is to really engage with the performers in your area by organising an event. So we are offering each local group up to £250 each towards the cost of running an event, maybe with some live music, maybe with a Q&A like the one we've had today, based in your community, that you can really showcase what your group is doing, meet important stakeholders again, and try and connect with as many members of the public in your area as possible. So we've got the form again on the Grassroots Hub, and you can return it to the field team by email. All of these asks are written down in a document that we will put on the Grassroots Hub tomorrow, and it'll have all the links to everything, and everything will be on the hub. We've also created an event guide that will help you plan any event you want to do, and we've got different tips on different kinds of events. And Scott, who's editing this video at the moment, has very, very kindly put that together for us. So very big thanks to Scott. We're asking people to submit the funding forms by the 30th of April, but you don't have to do an event by then. You can plan it all the way up into the summer if you want to. And we've got a couple of slightly lower key asks as well. So we've got a petition, and we're asking people to sign and share that petition. And the link will be on the hub tomorrow as well. We've had a lot of our groups successfully promoting our previous campaigns, and we feel like we can get a lot closer to our signature target if our groups are really involved in sharing locally with supporters, with friends and local connections. And if you want to share it on social media, that will be great too. Which brings me to social media. The last ask we have is that you share our social media content if you can. We've got some very exciting and interesting videos coming out from people who've been affected by this issue, with some quotes and other stories, and the greater the reach we can get, the better. So make sure that you share. If you've got any questions, you can get in touch with me via email, and it's on the website. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Yvonne, who can tell you a bit about how you get involved with your group.
Thank you, Maura. Hi, everyone. So my name's Yvonne Vanke, and I'm the chair of the Branches Forum, which is our local groups for those who don't know. And I'm just going to take 2 minutes now to say a little bit about our local groups. First of all, I'd like to say we have absolutely fantastic groups all over the country. And I really see our local groups as the beating heart of the European movement. We are really important. The sort of things that we normally do when we're not doing this particular campaign, we do a range of activities. So I'm going to just give a few examples to give you a bit of a flavour. It doesn't include everything, but it's some of the things that our local groups do. So it's things like street stalls, Euro cafes, events with speakers, online and in-person events. Many of our local groups write to newspapers and MPs, and many write for the regional bylines as well. There's a lot to get involved with, and as I say, there are many things that I haven't mentioned there. So if you're on this call and you haven't already joined a group, I would really like to encourage you to do so, because it really is great fun, a great way to meet with fellow like-minded pro-Europeans. There's a lot to get involved in, and you will be really welcomed and really appreciated. So if you want to know more about how to find your local group and how to join, then what you do is go to the European Movement website, and you find the link that says Get Involved. So it's at the top of the screen if you're on a laptop or something, Get Involved, and then it gives you the chance to find your branch or your group. If you can't find it, or if you have any questions, then please drop us an email so that we can help you with that. So please join your local group. That's all I'm going to say tonight. Thank you for listening. And I'm going to hand back to Maura.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Yeah, just to echo what Yvonne said, one of the best ways to get involved in the activism that we do is to get involved locally. And if you don't have a group in your area, then you can come to us and we can give you some tips on starting one if you're interested. The greater reach we get, the better. And our groups, as Yvonne said, really are the beating heart of what we do. So with that said, I will hand back to Michael, who will take it from here.
Thank you, Maura, and thank you, Yvonne. Really good to hear exactly how people can get involved with this campaign. Thank you for your time. Before we head into the Q&A session, we go now to our last speaker, Mike Edwards. Mike is an EM member and is heavily involved with European Movement Sussex. Mike is joining us to speak about what happened at EM Sussex's local music event. Thank you very much for joining us, Mike. The floor is yours. Please tell us about what you and European Movement Sussex got up to last year.
Sure. Evening, everyone. Well, I guess we were out in front on this. In September last year, Sussex EM held a very successful event called Unlock the Music. It was designed to air the problems faced by UK musicians wanting to tour in the EU. Now, a little bit of background. It came about because a branch member made the argument that if we accept the fact that the UK's re-entry into the EU is not imminent, then one of the best things we could do was to rebuild the links and institutions that connect us. And so was born Rebuild with Europe campaign, our campaign. Its strapline is rebuilding trade and trust with the EU. Okay, so we selected or elected to focus on three key Brexit issues. Firstly, the loss of the Erasmus scheme. Secondly, the labour shortages experienced by farmers and growers. And thirdly, the problems suffered by musicians wanting to tour in the EU. So we decided for our first event would be the musicians issue, because we thought that we could capitalise on the public's love of music and hope that would help us move forward. So we set up a working group, and I led it myself, and we set ourselves some guiding principles. We said any event that we did had to allow musicians to have a direct dialogue with the public, that all speakers should be well informed and have a story to tell, and lastly, the event must have legacy value. So about 5 months out, we started looking for speakers. In conversations with industry insiders, I found I was pushing at open doors. The industry bodies have done a lot of research on these issues. They've compiled reports and presented them to government committees, and they were keen to be involved with us. So we set about drawing up lists of potential speakers, national, local media outlets, potential supporters, etc. And then we were also thinking about venues, who would chair it and who would video it, because videoing it was being important because that was part of the legacy. So anyway, importantly, we settled on a title, Unlock the Music. And somehow, just having a name, suddenly it became a real project and a real event. Now, the only place for us to really hold this event was Brighton, being in Sussex, because it has a very large music scene, I think as a lot of people know, and an even larger base of music consumers. But we needed to fix a date. But before I could do that, my hand was forced. A potential speaker who I believe would add real kudos to our event said to me, yes, I'll speak, but I need to fix this date here and then. So I was still in my car in a car park. So I stopped, got my diary out, looked at the calendar and looked at the window and said, okay, well, how about this date? And we agreed it. So the date was done and everything was set. So it was now a matter of finding a venue. We were lucky in Brighton. We found a venue pretty easily. It had good audience capacity, wasn't too big, wasn't too small, good AV facilities, and a very accessible location. And also we could afford it. So now we had our what, our when, and our where, and we could issue our first press release, and things were starting to move. But as soon as we came down from this initial rush, we thought, crumbs, we've got a lot of work to do. We've got to finish all the speaker recruitment. We've got to do the marketing and promotion. We've got to think about the ticketing. who would present the event, and the videoing. Anyway, to cut a long story short, without too many battle scars and with our optimism still intact, we got to the day of the event. So anyway, Unlock the Music took place on Thursday, the 7th of September, 2023, between 7:30 and 9:30 p.m. at the beautiful and welcoming Regency period Unitarian Church, located slap bang in the middle of the tourist and entertainment district of Brighton. The evening was opened in front of an excited audience, as they say, by our branch chair, Helen Gibbons. Helen had recruited John T. Bloom. You may know the name. He's ex-BBC Today programme. And she recruited him to introduce and chair the evening. John T. has incredible in-depth knowledge of European affairs and is an accomplished presenter and journalist. The evening was in two parts with a 20-minute intermission when the audience could mingle, grab a glass of free wine and listen to some live music. On the day, we had a panel of 5 speakers, but one had just dropped out. We did have 6. And you can probably guess the guy who dropped out was the guy who insisted on the date being fixed there and then. Anyway, we moved on. We had 5 speakers. Each speaker had a slot of between 15 and 20 minutes, and 2 of them had pre-recorded their talks, which was fine because it actually helped to vary the pace of the evening, which made it run even better. The gender and occupation balance of our panel was just about acceptable, because we'd learned during this recruitment process of speakers that some of them will insist on certain levels of balance of genders or whatever. So we really had to try and keep a handle on that. And it's difficult when you've only got 5 or 6 speakers trying to cover a number of bases. Anyway, it's also worthwhile because getting a balanced panel does help the look and the feel of an event. We had 2 women and 3 men representing different sectors, from the industry bodies through to musicians from different musical genres. Tom Keel is the head designate of UK Music, which represents all parts of the music industry. He talked about the issues of navigating 26 immigration systems, some requiring work permits, some not. He said the Schengen 90 days out of 180-day rule puts a stop to many lucrative contracts. He talked about the reduced influence of British music on the European music charts. And he updated us on the work of the all-party parliamentary group on music, which has produced a detailed report. Then we had 2 solo performers on the panel. Heather Bird, a classical flautist and double bassist, and a local musician called Peter Cook. Heather Bird, who was trained at the Royal Northern College of Music, plays with many UK orchestras and ensembles. She saw the Brexit issues coming down the track and decided to move to Europe in the hope of making her touring life easier. Alas, she found out she could only work in the UK and in her new home in Portugal, and to a limited extent Spain. Touring elsewhere in the EU, she suffers the same problems as UK musicians. She estimates she's lost about £10,000 over the last couple of years. Dave Webster, who was briefly referred to earlier, is the head of International Musicians Union. He, at our event, made the powerful point that for musicians and all creative industries in general, it effectively was a no-deal Brexit. This has contributed to 80% of musicians reporting a fall of earnings since Brexit, and 43% now saying that touring is no longer viable. The CITES regulations, yes, CITES, means some musicians' instruments entering the EU have to do so through a designated port. He lamented that despite Eurostar St Pancras being one of the most common departure points for Europe, it is not a designated port, which makes many musicians' lives, especially if they're in the Southeast or London, just that much harder. We had another lady, Hannah Madalska-Geyer. She is from the Association of British Orchestras, and she gave us a chilling account of the issues facing touring orchestras, which I think, again, was referred to slightly earlier. Sometimes they have to unload their specifically designed air-conditioned trucks to leave them in an EU parking lot, while a local vehicle is used to move the instruments onwards. Most musicians now, she said, most orchestras now employ 2 extra people to handle the extra paperwork of EU touring, which actually represents a significant chunk of their income, about 15%, usually. Anyway, they were the speakers. After the speakers, we had a 20-minute Q&A, which was very productive. On the night, we had an audience of 65 people, enough to pad out the venue, and 8 people walked in off the street, seeing our outside signage, which included a well-informed music lecturer, several local music students, and a DJ. We also had a music teacher, several local band members, an opera singer, and a voice coach. During the Q&A, an equity member in the audience who hadn't previously said anything demanded why he had not been invited onto the panel, which I guess means, if nothing else, he thought it was all worthwhile. I think the evening was a success by any measure. The speakers performed superbly, John T. Bloom gave the whole evening a professional polish, and the venue functioned well. But inevitably, we could have done more. However, we've learned a great deal. We've learned that do not underestimate the amount of time it takes to put on an event. 6 months is not too long. The speaker that pulled out at the last minute underlines the need to build in speaker redundancy. One will always drop out. We underestimated the workload of publicity and marketing that directly affects ticket sales and media cooperation. In fact, media outlets were the biggest problem we faced. We found them hard to build relationships with. They seem to exist in the now, not being concerned with anything other than the current news cycle. And maybe if we did this again, we might consider getting some outside help in this regard. To ensure that you get important guests and VIPs to your event, book them early. Their diaries, we found out, fill up very, very quickly. And it would have been nice if we'd have had a couple of famous names to endorse us, to raise our profile. We nearly had a well-known retired opera singer and a cool musician-songwriter who lives in Brighton. But just like landing a big fish, we found it requires a lot of patience, and we just ran out of time. So think about that. I suggest that anyone planning any event of this sort maps out the evening running order as soon as possible. It's vital to determine how much time each element of the evening will take. Also, it highlights any issues of panel imbalance. And if nothing else, it makes sure you finish before the trains do. So, okay, this is our event, is how we did it, but it could easily be adapted to suit your resources or your inclinations. We've got loads of ideas. We've learned lots of lessons. So if anyone is thinking of doing anything like this at all, please get in touch with us. We've got some help for you. So get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for your time then, Mike. And this is wonderful to hear. It's good to hear about not only how you organised the event and delivered it, but also about what you learned about it too. And this really is a great example of how a European movement group can take action into their own hands. It's great to hear too that you had John T. Bloom there too. And for those who don't know who he is, he's a regular contributor to the New European. Now is the time to bring all of the other speakers, apart from John Collins, of course, back onto the screen for the Q&A session. And Scott's informed me that the questions have been coming into the chat. So what we're going to do is Scott's going to pull up those questions one at a time, and we're going to pitch them to whoever on the panel is best placed to answer them. So Scott, yeah. First question is from Russell Wark. Has anyone had any conversations with any representatives from Labour and have any insights into what they might do regarding this situation when, if they win the election. Russell, well, on the EM side, I can speak to at least. At Labour conference, we had conversations with Thangam Debonair, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Digital Media and Sport. I think I've got those in the wrong way around, but that member of the Shadow Cabinet. And they were very open to the campaign and to the aims of it. So we are making inroads there, and as well as with the other parties as well. This is a big issue for all the other parties, and certainly any change of government would, I think, change the landscape in which we're operating on this issue. So, yeah. Thank you for that question, Russell. What's the next question, Scott? Martin Menz. Apart from that, do you think there's anything that European Dutch bookers, etc., can do to make gigging easier? Aside from funding the carnets, I'm not sure. I guess I'd bring in Matt on that. Matt, have you had any experience of European, in this case, maybe Dutch bookers, doing anything to make things easier?
Well, actually, the first festival we played post-Brexit was actually in the Netherlands, and we were actually fortunate that the fee was good enough to sort of absorb some extra costs, or certainly make it a bit more comfortable. If it was just a one-off gig, it like John was sort of alluding to earlier, it's just not financially viable. So I think sort of fees generally with that consideration is one. But I think Martin there mentioned that some venues are providing backline maybe, which if bands are able to sort of tour on a smaller scale and maybe just, with their portable music instruments, they can go, and that's a sort of more seamless way of doing it. If you don't have huge vans full of gear, that might be a simple way for smaller acts to be able to do it. But on a larger scale, it doesn't necessarily solve it. There was somebody else in the comments there that was talking about the sort of Schengen and the 90-180 rule, which so many people fall foul of, and people having to sort of turn down larger tours or longer periods of work simply because they can't stay in the Schengen area any longer. They may have worked for 2 months already, get offered another 2 or 3 months work, but have to refuse it and go home effectively and miss out on that work. So unless there is some sort of on a small scale, it makes things easier, but it really needs a solution whereby people who are losing large amounts of money and having to refuse work, and it makes it difficult for everyone involved. Without a solution there, that it's still going to be quite difficult.
Matt, as you're on the screen, I see there's another question from David Jordan, and that question is: many of the issues centre on carnets and permits, but are you also dealing with the impact of the 90-180 rule? I know this had a major impact on people like Steve Barney.
Yeah, exactly. That was the sort of point I was making there. When people are spending, and some of your case studies previously, people might be working half of the year in Europe. Because of the 90-180 rule, whereby you can't stay beyond that period visa free. Certain states within the Schengen area might have a different visa free period, but that's up to each member state as well, I think. So that's something else you have to sort of navigate. And then people are having to count down their days to work out if they're overstaying, and they might get pulled at a border. Then you're in trouble because you've stayed beyond your permitted allowance, and then you're effectively outstaying your welcome. But that's just another instance whereby people are having to download special apps to count their allowance, and carry it over, and it's an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt. Next question, Scott. Is EM collaborating with Tim Brennan and the Carry On Touring campaign? We've had conversations with Tim. Matt, and I'm keeping you on screen again. You have a relationship with Tim, is that right?
Yeah, well, I wasn't sure how much of a dialogue you'd had with Tim, but certainly in the early days of, and they were really helpful and instrumental in trying to navigate that. And I know that they have constant dialogue with the MU, and Ian at UK eArtswork info is incredibly helpful. And I think you've spoken to him. He constantly updating and having sort of various conversations with different bodies who are just trying to navigate this and put the information out there. And people use him like on Facebook as a personal resource because he seems to be the only individual able to navigate this stuff and literally take on casework to help people navigate this stuff. But people like that are so important and vital to the whole thing. In that they can help navigate that and put that up as a resource, and hopefully little videos like this that people can use as reference. Whilst there isn't official guidance, the experience may be that we can help and it bring about a dialogue and enforce some meaningful change, whereas at the moment it seems so vague that we're all just trying to figure it out.
And on that point of Tim Brennan and the Carry On Touring campaign, I'd actually like to just bring Yvonne bring the mic to Yvonne. Yvonne, you said there's a relationship between yourself and the Carry On Touring campaign.
Yes, thank you. But just very briefly, as well as being the chair of the Branches Forum, I'm also chair of Northeast for Europe. Next weekend, we are hosting an online event with Tim Brennan and Carry On Touring as part of the Face the Music campaign as well. So watch out for that, because we will be sharing that on social media quite a lot in the coming week, and everyone here is very welcome to come and join us. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's great to hear, Yvonne. Great to hear that obviously Matt's got that relationship, and then he's working with you guys up north as well. So that's fantastic. Yeah. Excellent. Here's the next question. Joe Pye. Hi, Joe. EM team, what inputs have we had from Howard Goodall, who has supported us in the past? We are speaking with Howard. Those who follow us on social media, we have been putting out a lot of case study videos. In our press team, we've been going around the country filming people. We've got instrument makers in Wales who we've spoken to. We spoke to people who have left to Austria. We spoke to a conductor who left to live in Germany. And Howard Goodall is someone we're looking to get in front of a camera and have his story, basically. So it's not fully confirmed yet, obviously, but we are in conversations with Howard because, I know he's worked with Festival for Europe as well, I think, in the past as well. So Howard is very much on side, and we have opened up a conversation with him, Joe. Thank you, Scott. Next question is from Sleepy Sam. Hey, Sleepy Sam. What about EU musicians coming into the UK? What is the Home Office's procedure? I think John would have been able to speak to that question quite well. Matt, I'm going to consult you again here as our resident musician. I know I remember in 2021 when the negotiations were sort of semi-opened, that EU musicians can come here and perform a bit easier than we can to the EU. It's not great, but relatively, I think it's a little bit easier. Is that right?
Potentially in some ways. I think essentially they're in the sort of bands I know and in a scene that maybe on a smaller level, there was a threat of having to prove that you earn a certain amount or have a bank account. So looking at individual members to see that you're like any sort of visa requirement, that you're not most people who just wanted to come and play a gig or a few small tour dates and not looking to stay for extended periods of time. And again, that's a barrier for people. I know a lot of bands from, I'm just looking in the comments. There were some German bands that got stopped and refused a tour and sent home at the border for either because of carnet or either because of the sort of falling foul of those implications that we talked about. As far as I'm aware, it seems to me, in my experience, that there have been a lot less European touring acts coming to England they're either missing off England entirely on tour dates, and even if they're not a European act themselves, might be an American act going to mainland Europe but not coming to England because of all those rules we've talked about. You still have to do all the import-export stuff. You still have to do your separate visa requirements. You're still counting those other ones. And the extra hassle, they might just think, well, England's not worth it. The UK isn't worth it. We're not coming.
I think it's to me, it sounds like the headline is it's more confusing for everyone. And it's a bit pricier for everyone, which isn't really helping anyone apart from, like you said, maybe the Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for that, Matt. I reckon we've probably got time for one, maybe two more questions, Scott. So let's go to the next one. Ian Pounder, do the EU-based venues have extra bureaucracy to book a UK act, thus disadvantaging them? I'm not sure if venues themselves would have their own bureaucracy. I think it's more the visas. Is my understanding. I don't. From playing myself, there wasn't ever any extra bureaucracy with venues. It's more at the border is the issue. Unless you've experienced that.
I think some promoters might have to sort of consider that stuff. I've booked some people for a festival at the theatre at the end of last year, and you may still need a certificate of sponsorship for certain people. That doesn't guarantee entry, and it can. And I think Ian Smith commented about it, saying that if you get an invitation for one particular event, it doesn't necessarily mean you can stay and do a tour in other places. It's just that one event that you have your waiver for, and then you've got to go back. If you're staying beyond that and performing, that's an issue as well. So some promoters have to, might be a sponsor and can pay a fee for that kind of thing. But generally, I'm not sure of the other sort of implications for promoters. But I would say a lot of more tours just aren't coming as much.
Okay, it's a shame to hear, but good to get your view on that, Matt. Thank you. Scott, do we have more time? One more. Okay. One more question from Catherine Fox. Apart from informing the public and hopefully signing up new European Movement members, how will you measure the success of this campaign? And are European Movement making it easy for supporters to send messages to DCMS ministers? Catherine, speaking directly to that question. So the two goals of this campaign are, one, to raise awareness of Brexit's impact on the UK's live music sector, and to raise awareness of the post-Brexit plight that touring UK and EU musicians now face. It's like we've seen from Matt, from John, from all the speakers. It's harder, and not just for it's harder for musicians and everyone associated with live music and that works in it, but it's also for those who consume it, for those who go to gigs. There's less choice, and there's just a general lower quality of life because we can't see. It's not as easy to see the acts that we listen to and that we love. And we're also we're on top of that, we're working with our partners in major organisations across the live music sector. We heard from John. We're having regular communications with John, with the MU, with Tom Kill, who was mentioned earlier by Mike as well. We're speaking with the big players in live music about how we can get progress on this issue. And the ultimate goal is a change of policy. And we are asking the governments in London and Brussels to find a solution to the problems facing musicians. And we are suggesting a new bilateral agreement, one that works for musicians in the UK and the EU. And this includes a reciprocal visa waiver agreement within that. I hope that answers your question, Catherine. I think I think that's going to be the last time we've got questions for. We've just hit 7:30. That's all we've got time for. I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to each of our speakers, to Matt, to John, to Maura, Yvonne, and Mike. A big thank you also to Scott behind the scenes for making this happen, and to each and every one of you for joining us and for your questions. If a question pops into your mind once this is over, whether it's about the campaign or about the Action Weekend next week, just drop us an email at info@europeanmovement.co.uk. Keep sharing the Face the Music petition. order yourself some of these posters for the Action Weekend. I've got a blurry background, but they're here. You can order them through the Grassroots Hub. And we can't wait to see you all hit the streets next weekend. And do remember to tag us on social media when you do. Thank you very much and good night.